Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. Today, we're exploring a really powerful and honestly often overlooked piece of history: how First Nations communities actively resisted aggressive assimilation policies here in Canada. We hear so much about the policies themselves, but today, we are focusing entirely on the agency, the courage, and the sheer determination of the people who actually pushed back against them. So let's dive right into this with a pretty heady question. Just imagine facing a legal system that is quite literally designed to dismantle your entire way of life. The period following the 1876 Indian Act was exactly that. The federal government had this very clear agenda to just absorb First Nations into Euro-Canadian society. We're talking about policies forcing people onto reserves, setting up residential schools, and outright banning deeply held traditional ceremonies. How in the world do you fight back against that? To figure that out, we're going to look at 4 specific areas of resistance today. We'll cover the initial push for assimilation, how the Songhees defended their land, the resistance at residential schools, Pauline Johnson's brilliant public defiance, the underground world of secret potlatches, and finally, what that legacy of resistance means for us today. Starting with part 1, the intense government push for assimilation into Euro-Canadian society. And part 2, our first case study, where the Songhees Nation defends their land in Victoria's Inner Harbor. Okay, so out in British Columbia, the provincial premier, Sir Richard McBride, absolutely desperately wanted this prime Inner Harbor reserve land owned by the Songhees people. And local media at the time really fanned the flames of this conflict. Newspapers were publishing cartoons depicting a car literally labeled Progressive Victoria, aggressively running down a Songhees man. It was intense. Politicians were so frustrated by the Songhees constantly rejecting their lowball cash offers that they actually suggested stripping them of their First Nation status entirely, just so the land would lose its legal protection. But the Songhees absolutely held their ground. In 1911, under the leadership of Chief Michael Cooper, they pulled off a brilliant diplomatic victory. They flat out refused the bad deals, they kept their First Nation status, and they secured large cash payments for all 43 families involved. On top of that, they got a brand new reserve of their own choosing and got the government to pay all their moving expenses. Chief Cooper basically forced the government to treat his people as individuals with real rights who had to be negotiated with, rather than just wards of the state they could easily brush aside. Moving to part 3, we look at the deeply personal fight of resisting residential schools and protecting the children. Now, we really don't have to guess what the government's intentions were here because it was explicitly stated. Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald said in 1883, Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence. Total separation. That was the literal goal. The Commissioner of Indian Affairs, Edgar Dewdney, even argued that the entire system would be ruined if kids were allowed to go home for short visits. But families did not just sit back and accept this agonizing isolation, they pushed back fiercely. Back in 1885, at the Qu'Appelle Industrial School, parents would literally pitch their tents and teepees right up against the school fences. They camped there just to maintain some kind of connection with their kids. They demanded visits. They fought for their fundamental right to be parents. Actually, in 1902, a group of chiefs even successfully forced officials to stop baptizing young children without getting parental consent first. It was a constant, grueling pushback. Which brings us to part 4. Pauline Johnson and the strategy of public defiance. So beyond physical resistance on the land or at the school gates, there was this massive battle happening over the public narrative itself. Enter Pauline Johnson, a totally brilliant Mohawk and English writer. Using her Mohawk name, Teikaheon Wake, she cleverly leveraged colonial entertainment spaces everywhere, across Canada, the US, even all the way in Britain. She would go out on stage wearing a dramatic traditional outfit, moccasins, a leather dress, a beaded belt, because she knew exactly what white audiences at the time wanted to see. But once she had their attention, she used that platform to hit them with powerful, uncompromising poetry that forced them to confront the brutal realities of assimilation. Her poetry was fiercely popular, and she used it to directly challenge colonizers. In 1885, she wrote, "They but forget we Indians owned the land, giving what they gave us, but wars and graves." This was a direct counter-narrative to powerful government bureaucrats like Duncan Campbell Scott, who were dismissively writing that First Nations were basically a fading smoke. Johnson stood on international stages and proved, as loudly and creatively as possible, that Indigenous people were very much alive and they were demanding justice. All right, part 5, the secret potlatches, preserving a cultural cornerstone. For our final case study, we're heading back out to the West Coast, where a massive cultural cornerstone was criminalized in 1884. We're talking about the potlatch. This was a stunningly elaborate gift-giving ceremony, and it was essential. It strengthened relationships between communities, passed down vital traditions, announced important events, and demonstrated social status. For many Pacific Coast First Nations, the potlatch was literally the glue holding the entire social order together. So what we have here is a complete and total disconnect. That same government bureaucrat, Duncan Campbell Scott, explicitly called the potlatch reckless and wasteful. He thought it was a total disaster for the new capitalist wage-earning economy they were trying to force onto First Nations. But to First Nations communities, it wasn't just a party. It was a strict, necessary law. It was how wealth was distributed and social harmony was maintained. But suddenly, people were facing real jail time, like 2 to 6 months, just for celebrating their own culture. So many groups made a choice. A Haida chief back in 1896 summed it up perfectly, saying, "Let the white man observe his law, and we shall observe ours." And they did just that. They defiantly held secret potlatches. And they were smart about it. They brilliantly disguised them as Christmas or Easter celebrations to fly under the radar of the Indian agents and the local police. They literally risked their freedom to keep their culture alive, using the very religion the state was pushing on them as a cover. Finally, Part 6, the legacy of this resistance and a century of survival. All of these stories, the savvy negotiations, the physical protests, the public artistry, the secret ceremonies underground, they prove that assimilation was absolutely never passively accepted. When you step back and look at the timeline, it is staggering how recent these oppressive laws were. I mean, the potlatch ban didn't even end until 1951. The very last residential school didn't close its doors until 1996. And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission only wrapped up its initial report in 2015. The fact that First Nations culture is surviving and thriving today is not some happy accident. It is the direct result of decades of persistent, creative, and completely unyielding resistance by generations of Indigenous people. So I want to leave you with a question to chew on as we wrap up today's explainer. When we study this era, it's so easy to just focus on the crushing weight of those government policies. But if we shift our focus, if we look instead at the immense courage, the strategic brilliance, and the relentless agency of First Nations people, how does that completely reshape the way we view our shared history? Something we really need to think about. Thank you so much for exploring this vital topic with me today. Keep asking those big questions, keep looking at the evidence, and I will see you in the next explainer.